Hello everyone, today we talk about the Numena and the more traditional approach to religion, ritual and priesthood. I don't know how long this is going to take, perhaps I will split the episode in two different videos, but I think it clarifies much of the issues that sometimes arise from my general approach to history of religions, the meaning of Catholicism, etc. Really, as a guide. The video is not designed per se as a guide, but as you know, I tend to take a lot of time to properly explain what I'm talking about. We go step by step, and as I always say, I talk about this stuff plenty of times. And this is a video that, if anything, concentrates also a lot of that thematically. Now, this of course requires a bit of concentration as well. So while discussing themes like the sacred, deities, priesthood, and worship, I would say we mostly concentrated on the first two. We addressed a bit the third in the investiture controversy episodes. The worship part is also included in our history of religion playlist. But overall, it's important to highlight the archetype of all these elements, discussing the origins in particular, which when it comes to religion is never easy, because you can have essentially two different views of how things came to be. You can try to make the sort of, I hate the term mainstream, but it resonates so much in today's pop speech that at least it's effective enough, evolutionary view and how, say, the world came into being, what we think essentially, going back to the so-called Big Bang, what it's all about, and pretend again to fit this in, to fit religion, if anything, because this is what most people really do, to fit religion into this pre-orderly, like, this is the truth, this is science, this is what you've been told. Or you can take a more traditional approach that doesn't per se entail the denial of certain scientific theories, but also, and we'll surely make a video about this, should take a bit more careful approach in a strictly historical sense. I mean, from one side we may have very specific methods of measurement for certain specific material issues, but at large, considering the forces involved in the universe, think about how, say, more exact, for example, our history, like medieval history as we can make it also in Schwerpunkt, is in terms of literally knowing what literally happened in the world at the time, and the complete mess, historiographically speaking, revolving around prehistory, an incredibly ideologized field with enormous economic interests and with minimal evidence that it's not like it's not there, it can't be explained, in fact also in traditional terms, but that makes you question, given the relatively short time span in, say, from a strictly chronological point of view, and the magnitude of the uncertainty, how also some general calculations about the overall picture can be adjusted. I'm not saying again that you have to specifically take a stand against the so-called mainstream explanation. In many ways it's the best we have so far, meaning that, like, we don't it may be wrong, but it's not like we have this large amount of people that actually can't prove that or have any alternative theory or properly the means or the tools to understand what a theory or method or science or morality really mean. This actually can be extended to a lot of so-called scientists that are going to be experts, like in every field. As you know, I don't have a very high opinion of historians in general, but this doesn't mean that I go against some, at least overall, basic foundational understanding of what history is. And I realize that people have a tough time understanding this because they always think, okay, so this big theory is wrong, it's all wrong, there is nothing out there. No, it's not really, it doesn't work like that. Like, that simply means having unresolved issues, being ignorant like a goat, and wanting to pretend that having no education is somehow normal, right? The traditional elite were hyper-educated, and especially also in many fields at a time, scientific, humanistic, well, preferably humanistic, telling the truth, because there is this other weird spin-off of, you should just study engineering or economics because humanities are for losers or whatever. Our elite, our fathers, tradition itself tells us disproportionately otherwise. As Cicero pointed out, if you don't know history, you're destined to remain a child for your entire life. However, when it comes to religion, the other alternative, as what I was pointing out before, is this notion that at some point we will discuss regarding the essentially the fall, right? What conventionally speaking we define as creation, that was actually some kind of accident caused by the sin itself. And I'm not going to make now biblical exegesis, but you understand that even Genesis is the product of some sort of form of rearrangement even in the order of the text, of the inclusion of this specifically creationistic creation that may be the metaphor and probably the metaphysical ground for something that should be better explained in a strictly traditional and religious point of view. Including the fact that at some point what we call religion came into being, right? It's crucial to highlight this when the origins start, because if you go to university today and you want to study history of religions, the path is, okay, we give you this notion that basically religion came to be created by some people at a certain point, that we mostly associate to different stages of development, say from animism to polytheism, and all these terms that want to fix a rigid category, and that very often ignore the very content of traditional religion and the coming into being of the world and of mankind and power, etc., that refer in fact to a completely different story. That is not much about, again, carbon dating and, I don't know, the hillbilly that thinks that the world is, just a few millennia old, and that is thinking that it's billions old. This is not the point, right? Here we enter a dimension that is exactly metaphysical and that must be understood as capable of simply escaping, of travalicating, transcending any of these conventional fixed points of illusion. I made videos about, for example, the traditional meaning of space. We will see this also for traditional meaning of time. What does that mean? We talked a bit about this in the videos I started about Rome for the Jubilee year, that are essentially showing you the relativity of this in function of, in fact, the higher perennial nature of the doctrine of the two natures, and so the continuous decay and unfullness of existence of the earthly reality. That people, absurdly enough, if you look at all the top, so I don't remember, like, say the top debate, say religious historical debaters today, do not even take into account. Like, there is this secularistic, modernistic, for example, understanding of Christianity, whereby, I don't know, Christians do not want to accept that, I don't know, God at some point supported war, violence. It's a behavior that's all boxed into specifically human, that means sub-divine and therefore faulty and sinful and dirty, because that's what humanity, I will always say that. Humanity in Latin means dirty. The word where it comes, it means that. And that have nothing to do with traditional wisdom, traditional knowledge, which also the conventional language, say, of the Bible, for example, is written. Also, I don't find anyone studying, I don't know, Old German, Latin, Sanskrit, to actually browse, study other texts that are part of the same Catholic tradition, understood in, of course, the traditional meaning of Catholic. because it seems now that the issue is just reviving Christianity. But wait a minute, never talk about, by prescription, never talk about the fact that there are other texts that can, by the way, help you dramatically to understand the same Christian message from these other Catholic religions that you don't even know to be Catholic. I would like at some point, while continuing this religious inquiries, let's put it in these terms, to eventually debate some of these people out there, because they seem to have a completely flawed understanding of, for example, Christianity, whether they support it or they go against it. But unfortunately, that's truly the mainstream, in fact, understanding of Christianity. There are people, so it's a huge waste of time, especially for those who try to debunk this. You're trying to debunk something that even, say, the overwhelming majority or nearly all Christians do not have the palest idea of, just by sheer moral, cultural, and personal inadequacy. In any case, when did religion begin? And if you go to university, the notion is that at some point this was made up, of course, because that's basically the narrative of the story. And they want to make you feel somehow that the religious origins were more or less understood within the same meaning and sort of mode that we understand religion today. Just to make an example that can clarify a big deal, the term religion was not used in the term we use it today. Needless to say, for anyone that knows also the sort of posterior, temporally wise meaning of religion, say at the time of Caesar that we cited before, it was different from the one of the origin, but it was really different in a mainstream sense at the time from the one we use today, and it has a specific evolution that points, or involution if you prefer, that points at a very specific primary or originary meaning that would so limpidly explain what, for example, the aforementioned sacred deity, priesthood, worship actually mean, which is what we're trying to explain now. And we know what we're talking about, essentially. In modern terms, religion is often based on the notion of deities, perceived as separate entities, or, in some cases, on the idea of a personal God that governs the universe. Right? There is I forget the name of the guy that has discussed with Dawkins, Peterson, etc. That is very young. He comes from England, and he just a recent upload. He debate. I don't remember how the channel's name, but it's like, okay, I will debate now for an hour and a half Christians, 20 Christians as an atheist, and the entire I've watched some of it, and basically the entire conversation so far revolves around where does suffering stem from, for example, and the entire debate is the atheist guy and the Christian people that come to each other, and the entire point is the atheist saying God does not exist because he created suffering, and the Christians are trying to justify why suffering exists. It's not like they're bad at doing that, but they all exclude. They know some, of course, like the more acute Christian will bring up the concept of original sin, but none of them will actually say, okay, God allows suffering because actually we have a fault for which we have to come back to the perennial dimension where divinity exists, and that the eternal love of God stems in our potential, that of course in the moment it is not fully enacted, belongs to the lower nature, for which the fault is exclusively our own, not God's. Right? None of them seem to simply picture this sort of most elementary traditional notion that is so clear from all of this. And in fact, the premises there also have a lot to do with this personified deity that basically vigilates and oversees the universe and providentially, so externally, directs this, just presuming that he has to do this to prevent nobody knows there what, because if he's omnipowerful, he should prevent even suffering. It was a point of the atheist, like, why does he want that? Or maybe he's just an evil god that likes suffering. This is also very Gnostic, because the guy first very much with that Gnostic heresy, as many people say, oh wow, what if, it's all a scam, there is an evil god and a good god. This is not, there is no traditional foundation to the idea of a dualistic view of existence, of the universe, of divine power, right? Just if you think that, it's because you're completely later in the history of so-called religion. It has nothing to do with tradition, nor with Catholicism. And again, if you don't understand why these terms are originary, religiously wise, again, it's not my fault. I discussed this countless times, and perhaps this video can further clarify that, right? The other very important point there is probably the separation of the concept of deity from, let's say, from the universe as a whole, which is in part paradoxical, because again, if the attributes to this entity is the absoluteness of its being and truth and perfection, it can't be limited at the same time. And so this is just basic, second millennium philosophicistic boxing into nowhere, right? Of interest for religious history. This personification, including the notion that polytheism ever existed, for example, is basically just a decayed misunderstanding of tradition, of the time around, like the birth of Christ, by which every people had began to lose the idea that they could essentially save themselves. Hence also the split between church and empire that occurs later, because it's not Christianity's fault, it's humans' fault, right? Came to the point where that capacity was lost or even contemplated as feasible, right? This is also what most, I would say, Christians have issues with today, especially when they think of Catholicism in general, right? Like in any other group, it's mostly like some kind of imitation following, right? Imitative following. But the notion of being part of a group or whatever, that may have its positives, it does, but does not get to the properly historical origin of your own same tradition, of your own same. You know that in Catholicism, of course, tradition predates Christianity, even in mainstream Catholicism, right? So this is very important to stress. That should make you wonder a couple of things, right? But the psychological mode of believing that there is an external God that basically operates, and that you're just into the world and that you will come to pass, but God will sort of take care of it, is completely alien to any traditional religion, to any traditional knowledge. And the same foundational one for which the same Christianity was born, right? In the knowledge of that, because again, it's not like they by the time of Christ, this knowledge was lost. On the contrary, the aforementioned belief in oneself, you can argue, and we will see now, very special self, was looked upon with dismay, with, say, powerlessness, with fear, with essentially a prospect of loss, of defeat, of fear, right? So if you think that there is just an external entity saving you for no reason, right, you will fundamentally just get away with any problem, ideally, not being blamed for anything, even though in the world you will keep doing so, and you will lost even the same, I think, one of the deepest Christian meaning. There isn't much of a vindication of Christ, for example, like the entire narrative that I hear all the time from Christians about the resurrection is death and resurrection that are overlapping, of course, there, which is also very often not to be given for granted in a Christian understanding, of the thing is that this was achieved by God, in the sense, of course, Christ being God himself, but as if, even in the Trinity, the Godfather took care of the Son, and not the Son actually achieving victory over death by himself. That Jesus also went through a lifetime preparation of this achievement, right? You can't simply unsee there what it means to have both a divine and a human nature. And there are some theological issues that I'm not going now to digress on, because they would be pretty complicated, but the sense is that, of course, that spark of divinity, this is present in Christian philosophy also throughout its entire history, is always there. So technically a divine nature is present, is inherent, at least as a projection of God, literally created in his own image, even though we made that premise to explain what it means to be created again. So there is in potential that the possibility for that spark to take over the whole universe, which is what, Christianly speaking, occurred with Christ. Now, I'm not going to discuss this particularly. We're not going to discuss history of Christianity in this video, but of course there are many references to it that can, say, help people that are more familiar with Christianity as opposed to other religions, what this actually means in comparison to the same Catholic tradition of these other branches of the wall that correspond to Christian theology. Now, I will not digress also on the usual thing that people think that there was a polytheism. There isn't. What you see in the various gods or deities is just essentially a superstitious hypostatization of mere images, right, that were meant to represent in origin different attributions or emanations of the divinity that help to catholically and organically understand his complexity. They're not actual gods, and we are here to quite understand what this means from a historical point of view. As we were saying before, there is also an emotional state stemming from the relationship that the believer conventionally has with this hypostasized God that is often perceived in this sort of detached or at least distant fashion, that of course carries significant moral implications, but also important metaphysical ones. As we explained before, the main reason why you want to think that there is somebody else taking care of issues in your stead, which is a grave form of the responsibilization that God would never want, let's say. In fact, you cannot really achieve anything in terms of works if you don't do them, right? And successfully so through God's grace. And the further separation of the two natures, right? And so the idea of heaven above and earth below, but with a lot in between that cannot apparently be bridged anymore, as if now we're just humans, and we should even be happy of being humans, apparently, which is a heresy, I think, at best, if not a crime against mankind, more properly, and so an outrage against God proper, allows you to, in fact, be more relaxed. Say, oh, there's nothing I can do about that. I'm just going to die. I'm just going to suffer and die, and somebody else will take care of my salvation. And with Christianity, it's also like this is at least this is so common among Christians to hear, in the sense that we approach the concept of transfiguration through, of course, Christ's resurrection from the dead, but this is actually such an important topic. Peterson was discussing this recently. It's not that he understands too much about the wall, in fact, in this sense at all, but even he observed this very important point, because he often, as he points himself out, where he has to give the devil his due, and the sense being that Christ transfigured us, but the question is how. It's not like we are dying or suffering better than before. Of course, there is a gospel, there's a word, so that is an enhanced capacity. It's a witness. It's like it gave us something extra, but this does not seem to have particularly affected our physical or metaphysical state. If not, the clever Christians will say, like, this is true in eterno. In fact, this is what Peterson pointed out, like to say that it will happen, right? We'll see in the end times. For now, we just remain with this, but at the same time, yes, what have you gotten there, right? I've always believed that, of course, Christ's example, regardless of the, say, to a degree, of course, revolutionary symbolism and the absolute extreme of that, which is a true provocation, right, in his message, is the one to, from one side, of course, stimulate, like, properly the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man. What is that, right? Why should we care? What is that we have lost memory of, right? This almost paradoxical message that the Gospels provide is meant exactly to stimulate you in that direction. However, this is also a stimulation, in fact, in the achievement of Christ's one, right? In the Christomimesis, in fact, that differently what people see this in practical terms, like you should just start living as a hippie, which is not, of course, what Christ did to begin with, but in this sense of kind of lifestyle, and okay, be kinder, be nicer, whatever, has absolutely nothing to do, nor with the Christian message, nor with the tradition it stems from. So briefly coming back to the worshipping emotional state, it seems that most people's experience is just, acting as if they were in a sort of softer state, say emotional state, in fact, that prompts them to feel more vulnerable, to be more dependent on even some specific, stress relievers of some sort, like fixating with, these are actually useful exercises from a traditional point of view. If you think about the rosaries, icons, like the trees, they have been, of course, studied and designed to help the believer focusing on the fact mostly that the problem must be resolved, and that this entails a certain amount of suffering and pain. And it mostly, this worshipping ends with some sort of negotiation, like if I promise you that I will do this and that, but please help him, that makes this aspect that I seemingly can't control and so that I can stay calm in spite of this great stress. I think it's something that we all experience to some degree. I'm not making this video to criticize people who, say, worship in this kind of general sense, just warning them that, of course, there is a real beyond dimension to this, that in conventional terms you are not really excused to ignore, but you're sort of understood not to have ever heard, because this is part of the burden of sins that your ancestor basically unloaded over you, and we have all to cope with. Now, in the original expression of tradition, I think this was a half an hour introduction, but it was really needed. One would actually struggle to see any of what we just discussed, right? Or even anything that looks similar to this. We're talking tradition. We're not talking about the paganistic sort of fourth estate Pelagian cults that fundamentally indulge already into something similar. because in part it would be too easy. There are some debates regarding to this. For example, the Pelagians are not necessarily too fond themselves of designated names or images for their gods. There were, right? So, but even at that time was an understanding that certain forces in the universe were to be understood in a more directly connected fashion, right? I was pointing before to the manualistic traps you may fall into when you study history of religion. Because normally there is this path, again, from animism to polytheism, we'll explain now. But just to make a further premise regarding the lack and the lack of a necessary representation or deification of certain forces that are at large the manifestation of the same unique force is brilliantly provided by the Romans, that for a considerable span of nearly 2 centuries refrained from representing their gods visually, right? They instead depicted them through symbolic objects. Think about the Indo-European solar symbolism, for example. Naturally, this was paradoxically everything that was just even material was to be looked negatively upon, and it's just already a product of that fall. This is not what you would find, however, on a history of religions manual. That would instead provide you with the notion that religion began, one another with animism, right? Or at least, of course, it's not like historians of religions are that unaware of how things may have differed to some degree, but that is the basics. Basically, there are some primitive peoples that we also know of, and that seem to be particularly dull, right? You would think that this is the problem of the origins. Going back in time and looking at this earlier societies, you would immediately see like the meter for any other stage of development. It's not like that. Like if you talk with, I don't know, bush people just chasing baboons about their religion, they're literally the flattest, most, even materialistic and uninteresting thing ever. Like they think literally the moon is some piece of something out there. All what they think of continuously is eating and hunting. Hunting and hopefully eating baboons, and pretty much nothing else. Like literally don't give a blip about anything, right? They don't have any other interest. They don't have any other sort of form. And now, of course, they're heavily exposed at large to civilization. So they are also, unfortunately, for the sake of documentation, that kind of understanding. But in tradition, these societies would not be seen as the primigenial one, as the originary one. They would be seen actually as some that felt the most out. Actually down, to begin out of God and down from heaven, to be that flatly earthly, right? And having nothing to do with great gods that still had a much, the heroes that had a much greater connection, even as partly fallen with the perennial nature. So this is an issue, as you understand, even just from a didactic point of view, and you must really take a very strong traditional stand just to teach history of religions in the other direction. I'm here just to expose both aspects, because I'm not here to of course I have a great fascination, to say the least, or something more actually, because I think that that's really a gateway to more towards tradition. But I couldn't teach you that without making you understand the issues that there are with the conventional interpretation, and vice versa, at least if you buy that convention as a basis, which is what, at least at some point, we all began with, because we were essentially told this in a mainstream sense. I will not discuss here on how these things are seen today, how much people study them, because it's not like they're forbidden or you can talk about them, but there is a state of there is a human condition that sort of prevents itself from simply approaching them, because it basically brings you to deny great part of what humanity has been feeding itself with, just to specifically avert responsibility for its own sins and its further deterioration, which is not really something positive, especially if you care about your offspring. And so, for example, those savages, those primitive peoples would live into some kind of an animistic dimension. At least they do think that there is a spark again there is a force within nature and natural elements. And this is closer, of course, to, before we talk about the extreme, but at large, also those people do believe that there are this kind of spiritual forces. It's not a purely materialistic thing. However, animism is not really a correct way of defining the originary form of tradition, right? It's on the contrary not much a misnomer, but something that does not apply to that dimension. I will not even comment on now this weird people that try to teach tradition through this kind of savagistic, exoticistic mimicking of, thinking that shamanism, for example, was such this primigenial way to your culture, this other identitaristic BS, right? There is no room for any of this in the imperial Catholic tradition. This is just for testators, lesser people, mentored derangement. In fact, animism, as we are normally taught on history of religion manuals at university, would be simply a sort of pre-polytheistic, so even something that technically did not exist, germination of essences, of spirits, of souls within different things. The problem with this is that it exactly mirrors that fractal nature of paganism that in fact has nothing to do with the ruling religion that existed before Christianity. Paganism is just like the foretestators, sort of lesser people, materialistic superstition that fragmented the entire unitary power into some local, now we'll pray to this piece of rock. And so exteriorization of divinity towards something else, so distracting themselves from the most obvious realization that as lesser people were not capable to achieve anything, whereas the entire point of the universe back in the day was for the sole empire to take over the world. In other words, there were two dimensions to this. In this more fractal dimension, you can think that animism really developed into polytheism, and so lesser people believing that if you pray to a statue, brought to anything. So not pretending it was an external power that were just to propitiate themselves with in a pathetic way, like in a pathetic means really in an emotional sense way, and offering something and hoping that would magically work somehow, so just at a very material level, and having also deep moral, political, and cultural implications. This was always the counterforce, the lower strata of the population were lorded over by the superior ones that had to properly channel them, discipline them, keeping them under, and organically also using their own forces, as we explained in the video about the role of the Dionysian in divine transfiguration, even from an Apollonian standpoint, because that's the true accomplishment of Catholic unity. That is the same one with God. You can argue that actually the boundary between the two natures works in the same way, that actually we are the lesser element. That is true. In fact, this is how literally it was believed. I mean, the Roman patricians were the less perishable stock, genetically wise, whereas the plebs was truly like continuously degenerating further at a different rate, and also dying out more easily, because that's technically what would happen. And it's actually a pretty spot-on kind of politological and sociological understanding of the world at any point in history. The above step of this was not animism in the sense of there is a freaking soul for, and so a separated one for every single object I see. There's actually only one superior force that can manifest, right, in the way I can essentially become the medium of, right, and enacting myself, which entails a direct responsibility in reawakening the same force from within you, right, or through you, at least with this entering in consonance, in harmony with this immanent potential power in the universe that is not meant just as the universe, again, in a physical sense, but also in a metaphysical sense, and especially in connection with the above, with the heavenly and unperishable, perennial nature that can, in fact, save the lower one, right? Can invert the fall, right? Can transfigure you, just like Christ rising from the dead. That, as you know, entails also a very specific hierarchical order here, right? We are literally transfigured on the wake of his fully, aware self-sacrifice, and in fact partly literally modified for the better, right, through this achievement. There are very powerful theological implications for this, but unfortunately this is not the video in which I'm going to discuss them, right? The important here is that you get is that the notion that animism somehow sprang out from nowhere and that eventually evolved into polytheism and then into monotheism and then into atheism and all this stuff has nothing to do with tradition, or at least it did happen at a lower level, whereas the higher and the truer one, the one handled by empires, by their rulers, by their institution, by the mainstream religion of the time, that is overwhelmingly, as we've seen in many videos, documented, and that does not align at all with the previous notion, would entail an effort to come back to the one through this individual and collective, meant in hierarchical terms, effort, right, and relation. As you understand, the first concept entails some kind of linear view and some deterministic one, whereas the latter entails also a vertical connection and essentially a gradual sinful human indebtment that makes things actually sinking down further. So the first concept also aligns better with the aforementioned attitude towards, okay, well, somebody will save me in the end time, I just have to go to sleep dead, and I will reawaken at some point, at least if I have been good, let's say. This has nothing to do with a story, at least somebody else has to actively do that. Of course, in Christianity, the notion is that Christ has achieved that, and he promised his coming back, but there is a specific fight, which is also what more or less all these other religions stressed in the end time, which is not to be given for granted, and still requires you to, of course, follow the Lord's teaching. Remember the Lord here, right? Here, these are terms, like also the Son of God, the Son of Man, that are not a random, were not invented, made up by Christianity at that point. These were mainstream before, right? Everybody knew what they meant before Christianity was around. So it's also completely normal for Christianity to have had it. This is not to say that Christianity copied things like, this other mental illness of saying that peoples also a culture copied each other because they didn't have anything before. There wasn't a universal dimension to this. No, that was the only obvious possibility in the world, and obviously Christianity would have the same identical language like any other religion. So the dignified dimension of the subnormal animism is rather, in traditional terms, the understanding at the time, or the perception of the existence of something like pure power, which directly pertains to the perennial nature. I made a video about the doctrine of the two natures. I will post it down below in the topics comment list of videos pertaining to these topics. You can check that out for very foundational understanding of it. That's also a bit like the most mysterious part, or at least the one that is inherently impossible for humans to understand. I mean, what it means there to be a divine nature, a heavenly, a perennial nature that does not belong to our world, and yet that exists fully in absolute terms. But this is not different from asking what God is to begin with, but also what is it, right? It's a different, it's the difference between an ontological and an epistemological level, right? Even though they are, of course, intertwined. But this is the best way you can, at least the better way you can understand such ancient belief, because this is also in this series that we talk about. We're not doing anything else but essentially expounding this belief in historical terms, is from what we know on the basis of ancient sources about ancient religion. For example, and this is very meaningful because, of course, Rome fulfilled the ecumenic evangelion, the Roman interpretation of the Numen stands out as particularly apt, right? I will surely make other videos about the Numina, but these are really phenomenal, and at least on those manuals of Israeli religions, you will find that Rome, of course, had this vision of this notion of power, because it was a more primitive world that sprang out more quickly from the others. As if this stemmed from some kind of animistic, the Romans that already ruled, that already had cities, etc., even in very archaic time, would have needed to not to use names of gods or conceptualizing them simply because, I don't know, they were primitive and they hadn't thought about it. You understand how ridiculous even such statements really are. And that's why actually the real meaning of Numen stands so much out, right? The Numen, we will explain the etymology later because it's mind-blowing to a degree. In contrast to later conceptions of deities, does not embody a being or persona, right? This is not even about deification. This is literally conceiving this pure power outside of any form, even of human conceptualization of being or person, but is understood as a pure force characterized by its ability to produce effects, act, and reveal itself, right? Which you can argue is the entire divine attribution, at least in terms of pure manifestation. There's more, like, stemming from this yet. Now, do you know what's the etymology of Numen? Something apparently very banal. That is to say, nod. Yes, nodding, right? The etymology of Numen, numina plural, stems from nodding. Why? You should watch for some further insight that series I made on sacred royalty, eternally rising as the king of the living, that kind of stuff. I think one of those videos has the term Numen in the title, and there we described, in fact, how this applied, and we'll partly discuss it today, for those who could handle, who could manifest, who could enact the Numen, and that finds its most divine capacity in providence. That, as you know, so from the Latin etymology, is not our understanding of providence, meaning something that is weaving the fabric of destiny, and we're just following that because it's going to happen, God will think about it. This is also completely alien to tradition. Providence simply means, etymologically, the capacity of foreseeing the future. Pro-video, so to see in advance, right, to foresee. What does that mean? It's like the eye of Ra, right? It's the notion that through your vision, which is truly also the etymology in English and in Latin, from the Germanic visos, which means wise, and it was attributed to the leaders, to the sacred leaders also, the Germanic tribesmen. It has to do with, in fact, the same etymology of video, right? Wisdom, it's the same. And that basically referred to the capacity of turning, of literally molding reality in theory, so in the future, in the moment in which this was enacted, just with our own faking conventional understanding of time passing, as pure will, right? Essentially what the Eye of Ra gazes upon literally becomes, right, and is molded. It's like the sense of, I don't know, Alexander's conquests molding the world in his own image, right? The ancients deeply believed in this. So, as you have understood by now, nodding was yet another way, at least from the Latin etymology in this case of Numen, stemming from this, like from this idea of simply, okay, it's a placet, right? It's let it be, let it happen, let it actualize. Hence, just this positive nod would make that happen. So the Numen was, let's say, like, it's beautiful in the Latin etymology because it connects it very well with the concept of ritual, right? There is a gesture entailed that makes it happen, right? This is excellent, and it's a positive action. It's beyond like the material, physical movement, right? In the conventional idea of space, it's literally the expression of will that manifests in reality through such power that is able to change things, to make things happen. Consider how these rituals were all present in war, right, in struggle, and of course, Vivere Militare Est, and the entire Catholic tradition being founded on the imperial military meaning of existence, the eternal struggle to recompact the universe as one, right? This is the entire meaning of it. And so the authentic presence of such powers or noumena as entities that are both transcendent and immanent evokes awe and fear. By the way, the Numenorians in the Lord of the Rings are exactly the name derived from that, and you see how there it's connected with the sense of this longer existence, this almost distortion of reality compared to the more fallen element, right? And in fact, this duality is at the heart of the original experience of the sacred. What are you witnessing, for example, with Christ's resurrection? What is that if not like a distortion of the world, as you thought at least it was, in your own limited human experience, and not the normality in the realm of God? This is it, man. There is no other thing, right? And this is why conventions are dangerous. If you adapt to them, you don't question them. The term numinous, derived from numen, effectively encapsulates as well the fundamental essence of the sacred experience. There is, for example, a well-known quote from Servius illustrating this notion. The translated sounds, "For indeed the ancestors, overcoming superstitious fear, placed everything in action." Right? Here's beautiful, like speaking, by the way, Servius, a little biographical note, he's often referred also to as Servius the grammarian or Maurus Servius Honoratus. We're talking about a late 4th century or early 5th century Roman grammarian commentator. He's best known for his comprehensive commentaries on the works of the poet Virgil, specifically the Eclogues, the Georgics, and the Aeneid. Right, and this course, author has an antiquarian interest, providing significant insight into this early Roman literature, mythology, and culture. I have something incoming about the Roman sagas, by the way. If you're interested, this probably will arrive in some week, but it's already, locked and loaded, and it's, it can arrive from a moment to another. Technically, should have arrived today. Without the Roman sagas, you cannot go anywhere in Indo-Europeistics, in history, religion, etc. And the beauty of this statement is that the ancestors, so truly, what was seen here, we're already in Christian times, by the way, consider that. The ancestors were thought here, from a Roman perspective, to have overcome superstitious fear, like the pre-Indo-European one of the Pelasgians, for example, placing everything in action. And of course, the Roman sagas, as you know, revolve fundamentally, exclusively around this. And Roman culture being, in this sense, one of the most supreme examples of such understanding, also considering the outcome of Romanity. This definitely underscores that in earlier times, religion was essentially a matter of experience as well, right? Not much a matter of definition, right, but of action. Action and contemplation are always needed, but contemplation can occur through different ways, and it has always to ultimately bring to an experience, right, an enlightenment, something that helps your determination to act upon such wisdom, such knowledge. While various more conditioned perspectives existed within the exoteric tradition, those meant, for example, we explained it before, for the general populace, esoteric teachings contended that more or less objectified personal forms of divinity merely symbolize higher super-rational and superhuman modes of existence. So they were a metaphor, and or a degradation of that, some figures required in order to adapting to the understanding of the current humanity that is gradually losing that. That's the point why at the time they would use, these statues, these deities. Today I literally have to make a video on YouTube that nobody's ever made, because literally nobody knows about this stuff anymore, right? Or at least somebody likely knows that, but how much is it going to be really spread at this point? As we've seen also in other videos, the core idea centered around the genuine and living presence of such states within an elite group, or rather the aspiration for their realization through what is expressed as the direct path, for example in Tibet, which typically corresponds to an initiation, which is an ontological transformation of one's nature. This other aspect is important. There is a superhuman identity that begins initiatically, right? And this is something we've seen countless times in war, but also in this manifestation of power. Caesar adopting Octavian. That fatherhood was not less true, actually was truer, right, than the merely physical one, subjected just to human mechanics. It's not like, it doesn't happen through the replication of the spirit as well, but the notion is that, as we said before, the greater spirit can transfigure the other ones even without having at least such an immediate biological connection. This is because pure action is transfiguring. In order to trigger divinity, you have to be able to sacrifice the self, which is paradoxically the same way to be able to expand it and to take over. There is an iconic saying from the traditional internal doctrine, so-called, deriving from the Upanishad that says something of this kind. So we're in the Vedas, essentially at the origin of the Vedas. Who venerates a divinity other than the spiritual self, it is the Atma, and says, another is that, another am I. Such a person is not wise, but is like a useful animal to the gods. This is the Brhadaranyaka-upanishad 1.4.10. This phrase is very important because it highlights how essentially the power which you are able to derive from heaven is essentially expressed by you, right? It is in your within your power, right? Not much in your control per se, but it's something that is enacted by your being, right? It would be very important to explain how this is it's triggered to begin with. This is very close to the spark that we were talking about before. But here, the centrality of the spiritual self, which is actually in many ways the same one that would make you feel selfless, meaning at least the interior part of the earthly dimension of the self, and that truly makes you noble and fearless to the point of being a god yourself. Like those, this is very important for the conventional interpretation of religion, that person that is just essentially mortifying himself without cultivating himself. It's not like this initiation must not happen, this must be painful, that must be a cleansing from the previous sins. That is very important. That is just, in fact, mortifying oneself in entrusting himself to some external reality that, or say, entity perceived that does not exist, at least in the measure in which he will not actually act, but still only believe something will hopefully happen to get yourself out of trouble. This person is not wise, is not really able to exercise providential power, but is like a useful animal to the gods. This is interesting as well, because it doesn't say, look, this person is just contributing to complete destruction. This can happen, telling the truth, but it is just an auxiliary, it's a subsidiary reality that can be manipulated by the higher one, which is also the task of leadership, of the elites. It is what you see also in the great pages of Western civilization. At a certain point, there is an enlightened elite that manages to give the outcast like a chance for redemption, and essentially enlists them into the military and takes over the world, or large swathes of that. Well, that's the way it happens, because you can still, if this person exists, they're active. I mean, for the mere faculty of existing, like, it means that they are doing something right. And this something right can always be used from one side, but it can also be further cultivated and put at the service, in fact, of a higher order, as we were saying before. These are not insects to be crushed. These are the useful idiots that you can do lots of interesting stuff with, politically, militarily, and socially, if, of course, you are also successful in that regard. Certain experiments, as you know, in history did not end well, and in tradition there is no excuse for defeat, as you well know. Now, beyond this point, we enter the ritual dimension, because the entire point of awakening the Numen is to use it, to channel it into some important function that in turn is, of course, aimed at awakening further noumena, meaning that expanding again the imperial power, for example, to encompass the whole universe is exactly like the divine path that must be made of virtue. So it must be successful for the inherent valor of this medium. We explained this very well. You know it even from Augustus Res Gestae. Like, for my own auspices, this was his own expression. Like the fact that the connection with the higher was, in fact, inherent in the name of Augustus Sebastos. We will see now how that term actually recurs exactly in connection with rituals, right? Because rituals, in this sense, were everything. Rituals were not, just like we think them today, a mere mechanic performance. They are the exact action through which this power is vehiculated, right? The rite is not just, again, a material combination, like in alchemy, at least in the theory version of it, that is all actually a metaphor of this very aspects that simply turns stuff into gold, right? We even can do it technically, but it costs even more than gold, so we stopped doing that because it was the wrong way. But this is another point. The point is that the way the rite is performed is in itself the way the virtues can profuse his own power. In other words, it's about the person. It's not about the rite. Right? Another person doing the same identical thing, physically, materially, will not deliver any power because it doesn't have it. All right. Of course, there is all a tradition in ritualism that is as we'll learn now, is exactly what matters as far as the precondition of this power enactment, right? Within this rite, there was scarcely anything that could be classified as religious in the contemporary term. We didn't discuss the etymology of religion, but as you know, it has to do with binding, right? With the idea of being almost restrained, like kept within a certain boundary. This is in I think years ago I checked this on Wikipedia to see, when I checked the actual etymology, and I realized Wikipedia gives a completely biased modern secular view of this, because if people will want to know about this, they will likely look at these sources that do not understand how this binding is connected to the hierarchical principle of traditional societies. I mean, the fact that if you are, again, less, and you're not fully in control of yourself because you're not God, you must leave your liberty, that by definition is not freedom. Freedom belongs only to God. There is no such freedom for human beings, if not wishful thinking, which you may even reach, but you're not a human being anymore. And definitely I don't see much of that happening right now. And that, of course, has to do with this gradual, say, this master and servant relation, this teacher and student, this father and son relation. That is based on an apprenticeship. It's based on experience. It's based on the, essentially, master's capacity to imparting certain teachings on the basis of direct experience rather than some sort of strange abstraction, and correcting the distortions of this. You are not free. You're never free. Especially if you're not doing anything to actively improve yourself on a regular basis. What you're enjoying, since this process is in progress, if anything, liberty, right? You have a liberty. You have this beautiful thing called liberty that is the only one attainable, humanly wise, that does also evolve and has ideally to reach freedom, but it cannot be freedom by definition, in this realm. Like, it's not like saying there is a level of freedom in some level of political, institutional regulation. Freedom does not belong to this world. Point. Right? Liberty is exactly here the one that allows to further cultivate such performance. So the religion is capable of doing that. Religion is a sacred binding that is also imposed on you because you objectively don't know better, right? You don't know any better to begin with. And in this regard, religion is not even meant to simply entail, per se, devotion. Right, devotion can be done so, of course, towards your higher elements, but per se, it has first of all the preconditions of bringing you into the circle, so to say, where things happen. Only then you will learn, right, what devotion is and why you have to have it, at least towards those you have to learn from. But in this sense, he who carried out the rite, there was, as you know, in this time, depending on the time, but it was someone provided with an Imperium, with essentially a temporal and a spiritual power combined. The two things had not been separated imperial-wise, and initially, as you know, the kings were also the high priests, right? So this is also part of the story of Rome, and already there you see the gradual unhinging of the system, paralleling the contemporary human degradation, that, however, still entailed this, not even a negotiation, right? There is this sense of Roman pragmatism, for example, also in philosophy, understood as, you have to do, and it's kind of also the obvious, you have to make things work the way they work, right? And yes, it is correct, but it's not pragmatism strictly meant, it's just acting directly, right? Acting in the right way, because there is no other, right? And there is no other time and anything else to lose in the process. So the point was not, in that sense, cultivating a relation with an external divinity, but cultivating your own power to be in contact with a higher nature. Manifesting, in fact, through the Numina, that were in a sense the same heroes. I mean, even this principle of pure power, if you look at the transfiguration of Romulus, for example, this blaze, this thunderbolt that arrives and brings the deified emperor to heaven, is a manifestation of such power, is a manifestation of this force that may be from your side, or not, by the way. There is a beautiful passage from Paul the Deacon about the Longobards when they defeated the Eruli, since we talk about the latter, by the way, recently, that, of course, just like in the Roman tradition, witnessed the roaring thunder of Woden, the godfather. In the Europeans, of course, back in the Longobards, in that case, that, however, manifested also in other forms. And again, the thunder, the lightning is just one of those symbols, and you know how powerful that is in humanity, together with sacred fire. And so the essence of this pure manifestation of power that is incorporeal and also devastating, and just like reflecting, like coming from heaven, not really occurring for such simply handable means by anyone, right? This, of course, indicates an act of ritual, both essential and pivotal in affecting unseen forces and inner conditions from which such noumena could manifest, right? Ritual, in this sense, is creating the conditions for this power to manifest through the medium of the divinity. So if by divinity we understand the higher, the heavenly, the perennial nature. this bears resemblance, by the way, in its essence, to the methods that we use for manipulating physical forces and material states. Right? There is something also in psychoanalysis, at least the Jungian depth psychology and various scientific fields are definitely showing how, of course, the physical holism of body and soul can and will affect both dimensions at the same time. You cannot separate them from within the same person. If one aspect is affected, so the other is at the same time. Right? It's not even mechanical passes, just instantaneous. So when you look at the original meaning of priesthood, you identify this in just the intrinsic virtues that he possessed. He or she, because of course in the Roman tradition we were just talking about this for the sacred fire of Vesta, right? But in that case, it was still a matter of sublime spiritual force that was also entrusted with the preservation of this numinous power. Only the priest was capable of making the technique effective. Again, the technique was part of a sacred science, we'll see it later, that was not random, that really had to resonate with the cosmic order and divine harmony. But the person who had no virtue cannot make it work. It was both material and spiritual, but while everybody could replicate the rite in a material sense, only a few could replicate the rite successfully, so actually enacting the noumena on the basis of their spiritual capacity, their virtus, without which that ritual had no meaning, was empty. And in fact, this is also in the broader, eventually, decline of antiquity and the degeneration of mankind, what the problem will manifest itself like. We'll talk about this later. Also because as a medieval history-based channel, all the investiture controversy issue is based on this. It's based on in that sense, mostly to the repartition of the relative spheres of competence in a time which was understood that without a cooperation within these, say, two institutions that were, two powers that were deputed to all specialize in a certain part, it couldn't be like a single person that could be able to do the former. They tried, but they went close to only what the Romans had done before, and ever since things have continuously degenerated. So the term religion paralleled in the indigitamenta of early Roman customs, which refers to the array of formulas utilized for engaging with different noumena as circumstance required. In other words, in order to be part of religion, you had to be part also of the rite. As we were saying before, these rites were never individual. Like, they were not aimed at a merely individual power, because the moment in which the power manifested, it affected immediately the entire universe. There is no such thing like an individual action that does not reverberate, not mechanically, but metaphysically, and you can argue physically as well, like on the entire universe, because still the system is altered, right? And this will have consequences, right? So it doesn't matter how long it takes, at least in that mechanical sense, but in a metaphysical one, there is a deeper implication that will further, that it's difficult to in fact track through, say, conventional scientific means, but that is there, and that ancient religion was completely sure of. And so this is also why this religion was enforced, as it was understood that without it, things could not simply succeed. The problem was when the community was not up to the task. And so at that point, the entire, let's say, mode by which that culture had developed its own religion was put into question. That's also how Christianity came around, reinforcing the necessity for a more strictly epurated, say, spiritual experience that was the only one, in fact, to reinform the fallen secular authority that had failed, in fact, to uphold imperial standards set by Augustus, and the essentially revival of the Golden Age, as it had been prophesied between, as one last time, between the Bronze and the Iron Age, which is also the moment in which Christ was born. And that does have a meaning, that even a stronger meaning in that sense. That's why, of course, religions came to be also very complex, right? For example, the Romans had a very complex religious system that at some point, by the time it's documented by the later, the 1st century BC authors like Livy, etc., it's not fully understood, at least as it was in archaic times, exactly because that kind of, say, originary meaning that, by the way, it had in a system that was yet to conquer the world, so it's not like it was immediately better before. It was better in the sense that it manifested to that extent that it was better than any other in that age, but that would also lead to this other phase of descent. This is interesting, by the way, because there is so much in terms of quotes that, if anything, we will look at we can look at them today, frankly. There is enough time. Let's just see where we go with this, because it's a lot of stuff. But this is just for making you understand also how all that dimension of pathetic connection with an external being is absent, right? For example, prayers, anxieties, aspirations. It's not like they are not motivated or that they can't help, as we were saying before. That's actually the way back. But they're also the reflection of the person who is enacting them. Think about it, right? If you are desperate, for example, what do you pray for at the end of the day? You may not know it, but the act of praying is just also innate. And it's not much about the original, say, the mechanism we were talking about that before, is simply entrusting yourself to an external being. But it is about truly sorting out the system. You may argue that it works in the measure in which you're basically proceeding to this contemplative phase that will eventually inform the action, and you need both. But that's why actually prayer is useful, right? But to a degree, depending how you pray, why God is this happening to me, and you're not actually explaining it to yourself. You're not trying to be honest with God. You're not essentially telling, look, yes, it's my fault. I should have been prepared for this eventuality. I should have done this and that, and now it's so hard, and I know it's all my fault. I should have known better. I repent, all this stuff. That makes sense, but it's still the sort of condition full of anxiety and hopes of a person who has lagged behind. The notion with, in fact, antiquity, in the sense of this higher, especially this higher civilizations that managed to wield so much power and doing it so through the sheer virtue of their leaders, is, and also the people to a degree, of course, but is exactly this much more straightforwardly consistent way of behaving, right? A way of behaving that was, in fact, much more stern, rigid, austere, severe than our own. And that's not really, that really felt contempt towards all this kind of more emotionalistic behavior. Hence also the contempt, for example, against the way Christianity spread towards the masses, throughout the masses at the beginning. This was normal, inasmuch those masses would have been actually the same people performing the same old sort of weird superstitious whinery, and just bailing out, looking at this religion that looked at something actually more absolute, that however they interpreted it in a less regulatory fashion, and was rightfully contempted for these people, not much for the belief in itself, by the higher people that said, we still got it, we still can handle this. And they, however, failed. Remember, they were the leaders of it all. And remember that this is happening worldwide, right? There is no tribe, there is no people here that really still thinks that it can be done, right? They almost roll backward. Think even about, I don't know, many people think, then the Germans arrived, they thought about it. No, the Germans had another sensitivity towards the enactment of that force and the warlike background. But they actually believe, think about Arianism, or also the generally chthonic dimension of their symbolism to an extent, as the prevalent behavior also in the underdeveloped fringe of, speaking of Arianism, how in that sense Christ was not really seen as a man winning over death, was seen as a god, right? That the human dimension wasn't there because they thought it can't be. This must have been like a higher bond. They were a bit like countercultures, right? At least the elites were Catholic. They will fully embrace Catholicism in the moment in which they, even before Christianity, they were cooperating with the empire, were settled, federati, and so on, because they understood the bigger power they carried, right? But the average person in there had nothing actually to do with that. We were actually much more negativistic about it all. But that paradox helped to actually sacrifice themselves more easily, because their life was actually less relevant, or at least they were much more pressured to the point that they said, okay, either we do this or we die, which is what great part of the migration era was also about, regardless of course of sort of more certain easier opportunities, right? So that in tradition, even this emotion directed towards what possessed numinous qualities, specifically that of power, carried little more weight than they would for a contemporary person concerning, for instance, eliciting a mechanical event. And in part, this is interesting because we shouldn't remember always that power, it doesn't come from just nowhere, right? You shouldn't blame, say, many people think that modernity exists and they blame it. When they hear tradition and say, okay, so I should live like a paranoid person at the end of the world with just like in a hut. No, that's again the fourth estate, superstitious, materialistic, like reality. We should rejoice of the knowledge that we have in order to wield power. Should, if anything, being horripilated at the realization of by how many different unqualified people this is handled, and how disorderly this is proceeding, and how much unnecessary destruction and loss. But we're talking also in terms of spiritual and moral quality there is intended. Because for the rest, in fact, those attitudes were not really that useful. You can argue that there's also this other view that, of course, like, I don't know, the average person 2,000 years ago was better than one today because they had to live in such a tougher world that regardless of this sort of superstitious beliefs, they actually were imbued even with some more traditional sense of how to handle certain living conditions, and of course they were better than the average person today. The average person today is definitely not better than the average person 2,000 years ago, but you also have to consider the context and what we're informed with and what is that we mostly lack, right? That is the active part. And it is actually the worst thing, because say contemplation is preparatory to action. If you arrive to the point at which you over contemplate, to the point you start taking fantasy as a viable option to reality, and or you abstract and you just want to shelter yourself from the world, you don't enact anything, you're done for, right? And that's the greatest problem that we're facing today. Another aspect necessary for the correct fulfillment of the right is the understanding of the underlying relationships, ensuring that once a cause is established through the correct execution of the right, a requisite and reliable effect would ensue within the realm of powers, right? And more broadly, various unseen forces and states of existence. There is a reflection in the netherworld as well, because this hierarchy, as we explained before, is the one necessary in order to trigger through the right, like the elevation of the the massive forces pertaining to the lower strata of society. So without that, you can't have properly the support of the wall. You can't make it work. You can't actually maximize this, right? The Romans achieved that by literally conquering the world. A feat that, as you know, was achieved starting from the so-called chameleon reforms that had integrated, after a moment of great crisis like the Gallic invasion, by the way, the plebeian element in the army, right? And so the almost manumission of this lower element that we have described also in the video about feudal Rome, that had really been the Roman system up to that point. And that gave these masses a chance of redemption. And between this patrician and plebeian tandem, the actual, power of Rome was unlocked, right, and achieved, was spent, with an enormous force that was nearly unstoppable, right, and that in any case peaked and really brought to the connection between Rome and God to a degree that remained metaphysically inescapable to this day. Hence the whole Roman Empire, the metaphysical Romanity of the Ottonian house, and ever since, in fact, one of any other emperor. So we'll talk more about this also when we'll get to the soul of chivalry and the Ghibelline doctrine. However, this sense of place and of hierarchy and order, it had to be firmly visualized by the leader that had to command such forces and bringing them to victory. Otherwise, it would have not really been possible. And of course, all these rights were aimed at fostering that essentially civic, but at the same time military, warlike dimension. I made a video explaining the Indo-European etymologies of the early Roman political system, also that remain at the root of Romanity, that of course paint a very different picture from, again, the allegedly republicanicistic or democraticistic myth that we have been spread about Rome. As we were saying before, there was a plastic vision, not just of the psychophysical dimension, but the political and social one in this struggle, right? Finding the source of power from the system and elevating essentially the available material, let's say, so to say, in order to rise with enormous level of power, like manifest by many empires, and again, in that prorompant way that especially Rome represented, expresses the deep knowledge of the world, the deep awareness of how this works. In a cultivation perspective, for sure, the domination of the Clausewitzian Trinity. This is truly just the same Indo-European one. It's the same Christian one. It's all part of the imperial Catholic tradition. Allows like for the better combination of the three elements. Von Clausewitz is quite clear about this. You can't have really one aspect without the other. The Godfather, the hero, and the Holy Ghost. The hero here can be interpreted both as, let's say, the leader, like the true ruler, but that wouldn't exist without his people, so it's like man, right? And so it's that aforementioned, for example, notion that Catholicism, also in Christianity, embraces that victory over death, which, for example, Arianism did not accept, because at that point there is not a unity within the Trinity anymore, and there is a sort of true hypostatization, separation between the two natures. But and we've seen also we will see it perhaps because I don't think I'm going to finish this this evening. We'll have to look at more examples in another part, but if you remember the videos about sacred royalty, you see how one of the definitions was he was distant from men and gods, also associated not just with the eternal rise of the sun, but in that sense with the eternal victory and perennial struggle. That in that sense would be represented also in the conventional Trinity as the Holy Ghost, right? In this pure action, right? In this pure dimensional connection between, in fact, the two natures in virtue of God's grace won by virtue. And of course, the becoming is in the south, so to say. It's where that unity must be repristinated because it has degenerated. Otherwise, like that's truly the fullness of divine power and its infinity that sends this infinite grace, that bestows really this infinite grace on those who are worth all that. All right. I also explained this in that video about the Fortuna Caesaris, that illustrates how Caesar fundamentally adopted and was adopted by Fortuna, mother and daughter of the gods, in this constant gamble that is also very well known to all those who have followed his military career. You wouldn't, again, I don't know any conventional book that talks about Caesar's campaigns and just connects them to Fortuna. But if you run a background check of Caesar's military curriculum and you actually confront it with Boyd's cycle, you realize that everything gets to action, right? There's this eternal cycle that entailed a very great deal of gamble that is inherent in action and corresponds to the second element of the Clausewitzian Trinity. Essentially, you have to observe, so hence the contemplative part of tradition, deploying of the circumstances, external information, observation of the same, leading to an orientation that fundamentally is the product of cultural traditions, analysis and synthesis, previous experience, new information, genetic inheritance. This is all this is Boyd, by the way. This is not just to say this is a traditional, religious doctrine, but it is the same, because this is the dimension, the scale by which this collimates with science, actually, which brings to the guide, say to the leadership, right, that are implicit together with control, right, in the position of command in that case in the Roman institutional system, which brings to the decision, that also brings to further feedback, right, to the observation, but that must lead eventually to action, which is just a test, right? And then you get yet another feedback, the development of the interaction with the environment. And this is a very, let's say, and if you confront like what Caesar and Pompey, for example, did during the Civil War, you realize that Caesar was not wasting any time, right? He was always acting and reacting and entrusting himself to the necessary gamble that corresponds again to the inherent quality of the military in the Cultivation Trinity. And that has so many. I made a video explaining how, like, the Indo-European Trinity culminates actually with the Cultivation one. That's an interesting topic that I will also likely expand in the future. But this all stems from a dominance of the situation. This is not in the Fortuna Caesaris theology. Caesar will essentially pose himself outside of the Res Publica, because this was, even though sanctioned and therefore in traditional etymological terms made saint, in order to save it and to fix it, Caesar has to come out of it. That's the place that is outside, like distant from God and man. And Fortuna is the link, because Fortuna is the maker, right? She will be equated also by Dante later to providence. That is, remember, the capacity of foreseeing the future, so taking on action, right? This principle of action that embodies also actual freedom. And that's why Caesar was eventually a divus, was deified, because he had succeeded into coming out of the, let's say, realm of liberty, where he was to be taught by anyone, and he was at the top of it all, and actually outside of it, in a dimension that truly readjusted the cosmic balance that, as you know, had been shattered by the revelation of the Sibylline, the content of the Sibylline books. That's why the Romans, as a god-chosen people, had started killing one another during the civil wars, and had fixed this, right? Also opening to the golden age that, let's say, Octavian derived, like inherited from his adopted father as Augustus in its full accomplishment, right? But that had been the moment in which it had been forged. And this is incredibly important, because also the role of Fortuna we'll have to see in another video, if anything, to explain better how important it was in Roman religion, exactly because of the world dominance that eventually Rome literally achieved. So nothing is by chance, right? What is beautiful about this all, as you can see, is that you can trace traditional principles in the very essence of the historical reality. These aspects are not disjointed, they're not made up, they're not sort of taken from some, they're expressed by the same sources. The way Caesar, for example, was intended also by some of his adversaries. We mentioned Cicero for the third time. He's also a source for the Fortuna Caesaris and the quasi-divinity of Caesar, at least in the path towards the actual accomplishment of that. So it is really a lot of stuff, right? You can't study simply Roman history or history of religion without getting this. I remember all what I was saying at the beginning. There's always a reason, and not fooling you, and giving you the evidence. So the sense when, especially we consider the top priesthood, right, the one that for the Romans could have been the one of the Rex, that in fact is maintained as a figure with the Rex Sacrorum, also in later times, but let's say Romulus, right, it was both Rex and Pontifex Maximus, and always remember that, because the Maximus was, if anything, added later, as the sense that there were other pontifices, right? There were also other priests in general, like in the social body. But Pontifex means he who builds bridges. That everybody has told you the story, because traditionally in Rome, the magistracy of the Pontificus Maximi was entrusted with the task of erecting actual bridges. But the actual meaning of that in tradition is that the Pontifex had to establish the bridge between the two natures, right? Just like the Pope today is meant to do. And again, if nobody tells you, like, this is such a even just an anecdotal piece of information, but if nobody tells you, you're literally going on your entire life without knowing this. And the question is that you realize that the importance of not knowing this, right? Of course, in a negative sense, but you realize that this is the world you live in, and that you may have been stripped, in fact, of any actual knowledge of the single most important aspects of it all. Just for remembering also what Catholicism is about, also in conventional sense, and why, especially in the second part of the video, we'll see this better, like, and why that is the case, but it's not random. What I was saying here about the Pontifex Maximus is the fact that, at least at that level, there would have been no spiritual limitation placed on, in that case, the being enacting the ritual, the highest priestly ritual in Rome, in the Roman kingdom. In fact, this individual possessed neither hope nor fear. He only needed to act, right? This is, of course, as you understand, one with God, which is truly what Romulus eventually is. As he is transfigured, he goes to heaven as God. That was manifest in the perfection of his action, which is present at many levels. Of course, he is the founder of Rome in a deeper sense, also properly in the sense of the urbs. But, for example, Romulus and Remus, just like the Dioscuri, they represented the two natures, right? The perennial, the eternal, the heavenly, and the, instead, sort of still heroic, but still human at the end of the day, earthly one, right? And necessarily the first one wins, the other perishes. Even though the history, of course, of Romulus and Remus is different from the one of the Dioscuri, but they all reflect that dichotomy. Romulus is also, as we said before, as eternally rising as the king of the living, as the sacred king, the guy that is in between this space, and he truly founds the same humanity. He by mere action. That's how he kills his own brother. That's how he is able to recognize the omen of the eagles. There is so much in this tradition that shows how the Roman hero was not hesitant at all. In fact, I'm actually going to explain this in the video about the Roman sagas, because there are great examples. There's the episode of Mucius Scaevola, for example, that is quite telling, putting a hand on sacred fire, not being burnt, and being so actually inflexible and scaring even the Etruscan king that was, remember, in the Etruscan tradition, king and high priest, the lucumon, in that case had, however, failed, right, even in front of one of the many Roman heroes, many Roman citizens. And of course there is the more sort of, it's called in bracket Republican. The Republic did not exist as an actual thing, like a res publica means something else. But that's also what Pyrrhus was notified with by the ambassador sent to the Roman Senate, that this seemed like a gathering of kings, right? So of a stock of such superior people that were all endowed with this higher level, that at least for other rulers would have been not even the top that they could achieve as the leader of their own communities. This is incredibly important, right? Needing only to act, not because you don't have to think, because you already know what to do. And of course, this is a divine prerogative. Hence, actual freedom in here. This is the only liminal case in which you find freedom per se. So there are different traditions that we will have better to comment on in the other video that I will, however, make on another occasion, possibly next week. I'm not sure, because it depends. There are lots of different specials, and it's difficult sometimes to simply program them, as if nothing was. But let's say I like to take my time with this, because they're foundational. Like, if at some point I manage to form a hefty library of traditional knowledge and history of religion, probably the channel will also be about this. I would say that I know many of you think that this is my strong point. I have a lot of devoted followers that sometimes write me also privately, and unfortunately, I feel a bit guilty not being able to answer them, because sometimes they have such great insight. They talk also a lot about how what I say resonates in their life, like how this is truly, in fact, a shared experience. This is the point of it all, and that's why I talk about this stuff. And I don't know if people really ever understood the meaning of my channel, but definitely when I get these messages, I understand that they get it, realize how important it is for them, and more. I don't know up to this point how much I haven't a playlist on tradition proper. I have something like, if you search in this terrain, a lot of people, I guess, watch for this kind of content. You're going to find, of course, most of this. But I have the history of religion playlist that I noticed making really a lot of views. The positive thing about it is that it contains both sort of traditional, I shouldn't distinguish the two things, but essentially there are other videos mostly about medieval history in which I talk about the history of Christianity. Right? Some videos about tradition discussed Christianity as well, and we'll get, in fact, also into the, again, traditional Catholic legacy into medieval Christianity, probably the Catholic legacy into Christianity. We've seen also in other videos. Today, at the beginning, I gave a bit of indication of that. But the thing I like about this playlist, and the fact that people watch it with so, much enthusiasm, I don't know whether, yes, the playlist, as we've seen here, I don't know which videos, but, cycles, is the fact that people can listen to more Christian history. And I realize that even though that is always less watched, not ever less watched, but say regularly less watched than the others, at least they can attract people to it, like also interspersing the traditional videos in the playlist. This is very important because I noticed, for example, my recent video about Catholicism, about Rome, about the churches of Rome, has gained a lot of views. I don't know whether it was because during the holidays, but at the holiday season, where I got more views, and that's possibly the reason why, it still gets more views, because that tends to be the most viable, say, mechanism for getting more views about the thing. Here I see, however, it's not even among the first. Got 1,300 views, and of course I made also other. I have a pretty good record for these. They tend to get more views, interestingly enough, and differently from others. But it's good news because overall I managed to blend this stuff well enough. I think that the content has gradually refined in that direction, the one of entertainment in general, founded on the way I basically intertwined the cycle and the specials. That, of course, is a bit of a hidden alchemy from your side, but that, believe me, has a lot of strategy behind that. From last year, I really began to make a lot of this, to really strategize about this fact, which at large is importantly connected with just the way people normally would watch something before or after another, and it's not that easy, right? But I noticed that all in all, views are arriving, that even after, especially at this time with all these subscribers, what tends to happen is that I get unexpectedly, I never checked them, but I'm realizing it right now. I'm browsing the homepage of the channel. A lot of views also ex post, right? With not all of them, but tendentially most of them. The people keep watching them. They keep coming, and so even if at the moment I don't make too many views, these videos are gaining momentum, right? And everything seems to be working in the right direction. And it's really difficult. It's not like it happens so quickly or so easily, but it's important to recognize that the channel has been growing. Just yesterday I broke the 25,000 subscribers, which I thank you for, of course, and I hope we're going to further expand on, because it's obviously what we are here for. At the same time, it's important to recognize the level of growth that is always what you necessarily hope for, always increase. And I am honestly, this is the first time in the channel history in which it's not like I'm starting to freak out, because I'm actually excited by this, but I have the impression I can't quite control everything. To a degree, I feel slightly uncomfortable. Not that I have had any viral content yet or whatever, but when I see so much traffic coming, even if, again, because I have a lot of videos, so that's most of the reason why that is the case. That's also good, because when people concentrate too much attention towards one thing only, sometimes that's where issues, I don't know even what kind of issues should arise from this, but it's the moment I'm starting to say, a quarter of 100,000, it's not too much. It's not, I don't know how subscribers are the most conventional count of this, but especially I'm saying this, of course, to reach the 2 hours of video, but not only because I'm really talking about this religious history, this traditional history, especially content. That is definitely not a content like another. It's not really the most the one you would simply follow elsewhere, and I noticed that it has a sort of power on people. This is somehow strange to a degree. I can't say it surprises me, but it definitely does have some kind of further implication that I think ties more people to the channel in many ways. I hope naturally that this content is understood. Again, I'm not freaking out because I'm talking about this stuff. It's a completely different point. And I'm freaking out because it feels like I'm, floating on some, bigger beast and that's always like an interesting sensation, so to say. But we will get where we will get, in a sense. On the other hand, surely there is a very interesting situation whereby we have to be cautious in the proceeding, because we have to go at the right speed. We don't have to run. We have to maintain that. I could use the big guns immediately, right? But it's not like I would run out of them in a sort of broader sense. It's just that it takes really a certain amount of time to do things well, and without premises, without foundation, there is hardly the right understanding. Also from your side, that's the point. You must maintain cohesion, so to say, and I need to have a drilled troop before moving. Yeah. And yeah, this is pretty much it. Today's topic was dense, was interesting. We will finish this with different citations from different traditional backgrounds. Today we mostly espouse this with Christian and Roman history, but there's really a long kind of story behind this, and let's make things work as they should. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.